Thank you very much for coming to this special lecture by Professor Sharon Strover. And before we get started, I'd like to mention a couple of things. That first of all, it is real honor, and I feel we are very fortunate to have this occasion because we didn't really plan on this at the beginning of the semester. We usually plan the whole semester's colloquium series at before the semester, but this opportunity just came out of blue. And our colleague, Professor James Larson, told me a couple of weeks ago that his friend and the well-known professor is just passing by Korea, and she's interested in Daejeon and the Science Park and KAIST, and so why don't we invite her, and then we exchange some emails, and so this happened, and I believe that all the students here at KAIST, and not only our graduate program students will take advantage of this, so I feel very fortunate, and I'd like to introduce you, and then probably all of you have taken a look at the poster, but just as an official announcement. Dr. Strover is the Philip G. Warner Regents Professor in Communication at the University of Texas, Austin. There, she teaches communications and telecommunications courses and directs the Telecommunications and Information Policy Institute. And she has a wide range of research interests, which includes the relationship between economic outcomes, policy and investments in digital media programs, social media, the digital divide, rural broadband development, e-government, and market structure and policy issues for international audiovisual industries. And please join me in welcoming Professor.
Well, thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for this invitation to speak. And I'm very, very pleased to be here. I've heard of KAIST for many years, and when I learned that Professor Larson was here, I thought it would be a wonderful opportunity to rendezvous and to be able to meet you and hear what you're interested in is an added benefit to the whole trip. I thought I would talk today a little bit about two things, really what we call the digital divide and this notion of convergence. And we had a spirited conversation this morning as we were driving around here about what convergence means. And I'll be curious to hear some other perspectives on convergence. My own argument on convergence is that it's a term that is misapplied, and I think applied without very much thought behind what it means too often. So I'm going to talk a little bit and be rather critical of this term, convergence. And then knowing that this is a kind of science and technology policy crowd, I thought that I would try to weave in some development of this notion of the digital divide, because it directly pertains to the roots of convergence. Fundamentally, I think convergence omits or deflects our attention away from a much bumpier topology of services and applications for populations and for regions that miss out, basically, of all the supposed benefits of convergence. So I thought I'll speak for about 30 minutes.
Yeah,
or so,
30 minutes or so more. Yeah.
Somewhere in that vicinity. And if there's, at any point, if you don't understand or if you want some elaboration, feel free to just, we're an informal group. I'm very used to interacting with students. So just, let me know. We can talk about what this is. Is this a good place to sit, or should I be a little, I guess I'm out of the frame there, so I guess it's pretty good. So, thanks. So basically, this is what I'm going to talk about a bit today. I'd like to develop a deeper context for this idea of convergence and talk a little bit about, in the context of telecommunications, of course, the evolution of both moral panics and especially moral imperatives, because I think convergence has become, or what did become, a moral imperative of sorts. And there's a long history behind that phenomenon. And then I'd like to talk about some policy priorities related to convergence, which kind of opened up this whole field and phenomenon of the digital divide. So I'm going to kind of trace us back to the recognition of a digital divide, because even though it might now be patently obvious to us that such a thing exists, it wasn't always recognized in that fashion. And it's actually been articulated in some very different ways. And there have been some significant interactions between technological development, the political sphere in the States, primarily having to do with deregulation, when we passed a major deregulatory law in 1996, and the research community that began to and continued to voice some of the moral necessities associated with remedying the digital divide. So I'm going to try to kind of weave a story here that fundamentally undercuts a lot of the common sense notions of convergence, and that story is a story of the digital divide. In the process of that, then, we'll look at some of the economic and social contexts that more or less define the digital divide, and some of these group and individual and institutional roles. So, what am I supposed to click here? I'll do this one. Okay. So, you can't really talk about convergence without talking about the information, in the United States at least, without sort of talking about this grand vision of the information superhighway, a phrase that emerged in the 1990s. Vice President Gore is often associated with this, when he kind of said he invented the internet. Because he didn't really mean that. But this vision of an information superhighway really took off in the United States in the 1990s, after the graphical browser of the internet made this particular technological tableau seem not only intriguing, but potentially extraordinarily powerful. And the notion of the information superhighway actually has a long a legacy in terms of the way in which a lot of people related to other major technological innovations. It's my argument that in 2050, if we kind of look back to the turn of this century and try to make sense of the internet and all things digital and what was going on, this word convergence is probably going to be part of what people pay attention to. But it needs to be some attention that is tempered by an awareness that for a lot of great technological movements, we've sort of applied what some people have called a digital sublime to the notion of this phenomenon. So the information superhighway, I think, became a kind of digital sublime, as Vinnie Mosco and David Nye have referred to other major technological infrastructures. Now, I'm talking about, and I think Korea has had some of these high, elevated metaphors for the information society that kind of operate in the same way. And I'm drawing your attention to it simply because these metaphors kind of take a life of their own, take on a life of their own. And we forget what they really mean, even as we kind of assume that they're necessary. Suddenly, the information superhighway becomes something that has to happen. It becomes something that we have to build. It becomes so important to the economic productivity of a country that it becomes naturalized. And that's the power of a metaphor in many different fields. And metaphors are really interesting things to look at, when they take hold. And I think that when we talk about the internet and this notion of an information economy or an information society or an information superhighway, they're really all the same thing. I think we have to be aware that these became very exalted metaphors without a whole lot of attention to how the metaphor would actually, how the reality undergirding the metaphor would really play out in society. In many countries that adopted that metaphor, there was an explicit link between the metaphor and economic development. And it was almost an unthinking link. I think we almost take it for granted that you can't be economically productive unless you somehow have internet everywhere. Now, unless you are indeed an information economy. But you know, when you dig down and look at the data, there's not enough data there to really show a strong link between these two. Not without controlling for a lot of other things that are going on simultaneously. But this notion that economic development was almost the same thing, or was the tail behind the information society dog, or something like that, to really stretch my own metaphor. You know, was something that really kind of accompanied it very easily. And it happened, and this phenomenon occurred all over the world. It occurred here, of course. It certainly occurred in Europe. It occurred in Canada. And you can look at many of the policy initiatives in the 1990s as societies said, oh my God, we're falling behind. There's this new technology. We have to become digital. We need to build an information society. And in particular, we need to deregulate various industries in order to build it. And this was the deregulation initiative in the United States. It kind of spread to the UK with Margaret Thatcher, and then kind of diffused all over the world, that exalted the private sector and everything that it could do. And indeed, to this day, there's a kind of antipathy toward tampering with the private sector, lest this innovative, supposedly highly productive electronics and software industry be somehow fettered by regulations. That there was a strong belief that went along with the development of the information society in our country, that the private sector had to build it. And government was just going to do what it could to smooth the way. You know, and deregulation became part of that. There was also a belief that killer apps would be these occasional bursts of energy that would catapult us into a new generation of the internet. So there was a strong belief, and indeed a continued search for killer apps that would be the next greatest thing to move us into the latest technological plateau. And that became kind of part of the digital sublime here as well, killer apps. And then in the States, and I think this is true among kind of computer scientists and the computer industry in many places, there was also a curious, what I'll call libertarian sentiment. And this is a sentiment that I can best describe as saying, this technology doesn't need the government. It's going to free everybody. It's going to enhance individual choice and really move a lot of power out to end users. So therefore, the libertarians would say, we don't want the government interfering here. It's very technocentric kind of concept. We just want to invest in technology, and that's going to be the salvation of society, basically. The problem with that was that this was broadly espoused, and indeed is part of what I would call the digital sublime. But during the 1990s, as we began to see how the information economy was kind of rolling out and what it meant, more and more disparities across population groups became very, very evident. So, for example, this is small enough for me to pretty much make this out. This is, I'm going to just run through some historical data rather quickly. The government began to take a look began to monitor, actually, things like the numbers of households that had computers, as well as the numbers of households that accessed the internet. computers they began to look at back in the 1980s as another variant on the digital sublime. When computers became, here are these great powerful tools, we need to make sure more people have them, the Census Bureau began to monitor the diffusion of computers. And you can see the top dotted line was the plot from 1984 through the year 2000 of computer diffusion. And by the year 2000, only 51% of the households of U.S. households have a computer. Respectable, but maybe not as many households as one might have hoped for at that time. So to internet access, well, it had a very steep climb once internet access technologies became available. It was only at 41% by the year 2000. Similarly, if you begin to look at, you probably can't see the fine print down there on this one. If you begin to look at different kinds of families, though, married couple with children is the bar on the left, a male head of household with a child under 18, female household with a child under 18 is this bar, families without kids and non-family households. You begin to get a sense of some disparities here in terms of computer ownership. You see that a married couple with children have the highest computer ownership rates, and non-family households, single people, were coming in rather low on computer ownership. So there were some disparities that were becoming very evident through the data gathering that the government was going through. If you look by income, this is just ripped off from a government report. It has that vintage graphic quality, I think. But here too, you can see, and as you get higher incomes, you have a greater percentage of households with computers, and you can see very clearly that households at the lower end of the income scale didn't have computers. So more evidence was kind of becoming very apparent that the disparities existed, and that the information society and informatization more generally wasn't really penetrating through all the layers of society. When we look at location, these same disparities become very, very obvious as well. Here, this column shows urban penetration of internet use. This again is back in the year 2000, was at 42%. In central cities, where there are often hardcore poorer populations, it was about 5 percentage points lower. And in rural areas, it was also quite a bit lower. So there was some spatial divisions that began to concern people a great deal. So that lest we think that these gaps would ultimately disappear over time, and computers will filter out, internet use will filter out, a trickle-down theory of technological diffusion, which perhaps is something that you encountered in some of your classes. What we found was that even by 2010, there were still disparities. Now we're not talking about just computer adoption, but we're looking at the newest technological front, which is broadband, a higher capacity, faster kind of connection. But the disparities are still there. The national average in 2010 for broadband adoption in the country was 65%, which might surprise you, because Korea's is quite a bit higher. But if you look at low-income populations, it's down at 40%. Less educated, people without a high school degree, 24%. Rural populations, 50%. Older people, 35%. Disabled folks, 42%. And then ethnic and racial minorities were also below the national average. So the whole notion of the trickle-down theory and the promises of the digital sublime really weren't delivering exactly as we thought they would. And this notion of convergence that suggests a kind of homogeneous dispersion of the benefits of an information society and the benefits of technology wasn't really working out fundamentally. So this then brought us to what, as government began to amass this data, the issue was, well, what do you do about it, really? So if the 1990s was this kind of technocentric, let the internet grow, people will buy their own computers, it's trickle down, not much government action other than to coin the term information superhighway and to draw public attention to the significance of this technology. By about 1996, the industry itself was kind of clamoring for more expansion opportunities, and the government said, okay, we're going to get out of your way. And they passed some major legislation that I referred to earlier, the 1996 Telecommunications Act. And fundamentally, it deregulated the telecom companies. And these were the companies that were building the networks, cable companies and telecom companies. The other very interesting thing, though, that happened in 1996 is the government kind of carved out one protected sphere. It said, basically, there are two institutions that we need to make sure are getting the benefits of the information economy and technological convergence. And those are libraries and schools. Libraries and public schools, K through 12, basically. So a program was created called E-Rate. Has anybody ever heard of E-Rate? Never heard of it? It basically is a government funding program that provided the funds to get internet connectivity, and a little later they added the ability for schools and libraries to actually purchase computers through this particular program. So E-Rate was a first because it was the government's it was the first time the government really acknowledged that we need to do something to make sure that the benefits of the internet are shared more broadly, lest these institutions be passed by. And actually, this program was very successful, so that you can see the big climb here in internet access in schools occurs just after the E-Rate program came into effect. You can see the slope of this line is extremely steep. You know, it was kind of trucking along here, but then it takes a steep uptick once the E-Rate program was in full force. And now this ends at 2005. The statistic now is, 98% of our schools have E-Rate enabled internet access of some sort. That's not to say that all the problems are solved within the schools with respect to internet access, but it was a clear indication that E-Rate was extremely useful to this particular privileged institution, public schools. And as for libraries, first of all, I should point out that in the States, the public library is often the only place, especially in smaller towns, where you can get free internet access. And so they become important so-called third places for internet access, work being one place, home being another. The library is an important third point of access, particularly for populations that can't afford to purchase their own internet access. So more than, as of 2010, more than 71% of the library said that they were the only provider of free access to the internet. And most of this was because of the E-Rate program, fundamentally. Otherwise, libraries are not exceptionally well funded. They really needed this program. So, so the E-Rate program became this little pocket of success with respect to some of the broad social benefits of the internet. At the same time, at about the year 2000 or so, the government also began to be worried about these continuing disparities. However, just to kind of illustrate the influence of politics, this was also a time in which a Republican president was elected. And Republicans are rather different from Democrats in the United States. They're never that different, but they are different. They are different with respect to government investment. And whereas it was a Democratic presidential administration that initiated E-Rate, when we moved to a Republican administration, there was resounding faith in the ability of the private sector to deliver benefits here. So there was kind of a shrinkage of government interest in in the disparities between access to the internet. But a new word also began to kind of circulate, and that word was adoption. But it was adoption beyond the simple notion of physical access to the internet. If the point of E-rate and the point of a lot of the original statistic gathering was to just show where the network reached, where it existed and where it didn't exist, a kind of second phase became more interested with what it meant to people who wanted to actually then use the internet. In other words, access was one thing. Building out the network was a necessary condition, but it didn't automatically mean that people would use it. And that's where issues of adoption began to circulate and be studied. Just in terms of the simple access equation, this is a map that illustrates the percentage of homes with broadband availability. And basically here, red is bad. Dark blue, the blue shades are pretty good. Wherever the country is colored blue, there is fairly good internet access. But red is like 0 to 5% availability. The yellow colors here range from 20 to 50%. So you can see there's a lot of areas in the States, and most of those are rural areas, where even by 2010, the availability of a decent, was considered in the States decent. I don't think 4 megabits would be considered decent here. But this availability was mapped, and you could see that there was just still a huge need. Now I would bracket that by saying that if you look at Alaska here, there's not many people in Alaska either. So this is kind of the fundamental tension in the United States with respect to broadband access. It's that we've got these huge land expanses with a highly dispersed population, not many people in states like Alaska. You know, I live in Texas. I'm right around there somewhere. And this area of Texas is very sparsely populated. So again, the economics kind of rear their ugly head there. The economic case was not automatically there. But so access was still an issue, but there were issues even beyond access. This is another one of these great statistical charts that goes up to 2010. And you can see here that, of course, phone penetration is nearly 100%. They stopped gathering data on computers because they seem to reach critical mass. But the red line is internet dial-up, basically. This line is internet broadband. People were obviously kind of abandoning dial-up, or it was merging into the same definition, really. But by 2010, only 68% of the population was using broadband or had adopted broadband more generally. Yet, population-wise, it was far more available than that 68%. So the question was beginning to come, well, why aren't they adopting this? Why aren't people using the internet, even when it's there? Why aren't those statistics higher? And many different studies began to confirm over and over and over again, that this column is the main reason for no broadband internet. This is the main reason for no internet at all. The main reason is people say they don't need it or they're not interested. A second reason was an affordability matter. It was that it was too expensive. And indeed, if you look across many countries, the internet in the United States is slower and more expensive than the internet is in many countries, including Korea. Korea is a much better deal in many ways. Other reasons were, you could use it somewhere else, or that it wasn't a very small percentage said it's just not available here. But really, these two reasons, that it was too expensive or that they weren't interested in it, were beginning to emerge resoundingly as explanations for why people were not adopting. So it put a different kind of twist on what the digital divide was all about. It wasn't about access anymore. It had a lot more to do with affordability and this, why do I need it? Why should I use it? Why is it good for me? When you look at urban versus rural, you still see a lot of disparities, especially in broadband. And we see in various studies that those same reasons I just illustrated were at work in these regions as well. So big disparity between rural broadband, 57% compared to urban broadband at 70%. Rural areas in the United States, predictably, are poorer, and people are less well educated. So those demographic correlates have a factor in here. But this also corresponds to people saying, I don't need the internet. Why should I use it? As well as saying, I don't have enough money for it. So the whole discourse around the definition of the digital divide kind of morphed into something a little different after the year 2000. It was this, well, why aren't people using it? And then a few other researchers, like Jan van Dijk and Esther Hardenbeck, also began to argue that people say they know how to use the internet and that they're actually using it, but there are layers to their actual abilities to use the internet. And they did a lot of research and found out, for example, that if you asked even students in college if they knew what these terms meant, a pretty high percentage of them didn't know. They said they were internet savvy, they were using the internet. They didn't know what those terms meant. This was Hardenbeck's research in particular. Van Dijk went in and actually gave people little exercises and said, can you do this? Can you retrieve a file from the internet? Can you download this attachment? Can you do, these various tasks? And he found people couldn't do it. So while they're great at surfing the internet and updating their Facebook status, maybe, they really, the literacy, their literacy, digital literacy, if you will, was really not very deep. It was a pretty shallow phenomenon. At the same time, another big national survey that Oregon undertook found that there were some attitudinal issues that figured in this whole issue of adoption as well. And he found that people who weren't using the internet said there's a lot of privacy hazards to using the internet, and their level of fear of like identity theft and things like that was much higher than people who already used the internet. By the same token, he also found that people who were using the internet were really interested in a lot of the social uses of the internet. And this isn't what anybody had anticipated back in the 90s, that the internet would be a way for you to keep in touch with your friends and your family, and that those social uses would be such a big motivator. So this digital divide, once you get into the language that goes beyond simple access and beyond simple adoption, becomes a little bit more complicated, because it has a lot to do with social circles, it has a lot to do with affordability, but it also has a lot to do with these inhibitors that help to explain why people say, I have no reason to use it, or I'm afraid of it as well. This then brings us up to a very contemporary policy program. During lunch I was talking a little bit about this program that this was a government program when we changed administrations back to a Democrat. We actually had a government that was more cognizant of these social disparities and that was interested in these adoption dynamics. And so the government actually invested in a new program to try to do multiple things. One was to roll out more access, because there was still a lot of disparity in rural areas. But another part, this gets a little complicated, so I'm not going to go into it in detail. Another part of it had to do with making strategic investments into a segment of the network called the middle mile that would essentially create competitive circumstances for incumbent telecom companies. The argument being that they weren't hustling, they weren't acting, they weren't being very proactive in delivering their services. So we need to create some alternative infrastructure here so that they will face competition and perhaps improve their performance and behavior. So that was a big chunk of what this government investment went for. And then two other programs set up a lot of public computing centers and also a lot of training programs targeting urban, usually center city populations. So we were kind of swinging back again toward a more proactive government that was sympathetic to some of these social disparities. And those ARA programs invested about $8 billion or so. This I've got two tables that add another dimension to why the government acted. One reason, of course, was these social disparities I've been talking about. This was another reason, however, and there are a lot of variations on this ITU data. But basically, this ITU data is gathered annually, and it kind of just orders the countries by their broadband speeds. And you can find some that also will trace a line through for the cost of the broadband speed. And here's the United States. I can't tell you how much this rankled people in the United States. The United States doesn't like to be that low on broadband penetration. You know, the United States invented the internet. You know, so there's been a lot of public debate about ITU statistics and the ranking of the United States, and a lot of explanations or rationales, really, for why the United States had such a poor showing. Korea's up on top, of course, and why the United States is, you know, right below the United States is the Czech Republic. It really caused a lot of controversy in policy circles that the United States was performing rather poorly here. So that, I count that as a second impetus for why ARA and why there was renewed investment.
Do you know where Japan or China fit in?
Oh, sorry. They're not on here because this is the OECD countries. I think. No, it's not OECD.
Just guess.
I don't actually. Are they on this one perhaps? I think this is probably. There's Japan.
Right.
Okay. So here's Japan. Here's the United States. You know, these drive people crazy in the policy community in the United States. So I mean, the upshot of that was at least there was debate. At least there was a kind of more conscious, active discussion of why isn't the United States doing a little bit better in terms of broadband provision and broadband and uptick adoption in general. So there were these two major programs that the Obama administration initiated to, as I said, create infrastructure, create competition, try to break open some so-called bottleneck networks. And they actually included, and this is significant for people in a university setting, they actually included an evaluation. And this is a very interesting dynamic, I think, in public policy, because it's all too often the case that initiatives and lots of money is invested in programs, and they're never really evaluated. They're never really assessed for the extent to which they achieve their outcomes. And this, to their credit, they were willing to undertake an evaluation. It's patently obvious that many of these programs don't want to be evaluated because they don't want bad news. You know, and I think this is worldwide. This is worldwide. So evaluations are a kind of mixed bag from the programs, but to their credit, they are actually doing an evaluation right now of this particular program. That's not really very interesting, Malcolm. So the other nuance, just to kind of wrap up this story of the digital divide and it's kind of the way in which it's sort of seesawed between politics and technological capabilities, has to do with redefining another major policy, and this occurred under the Obama administration as well, called universal service. Has anybody ever heard of that phrase, universal service? Because a lot of countries have universal service policies. Originally, universal service is just a policy that refers to a commitment to ensure that everybody has access to telephone service. It's been historically defined in terms of telephone. Well, by 2010, the telephone is an app, fundamentally, right? If you have a broadband network, if you have a smartphone, voice telephony is just an app. You know, so the whole notion of having a universal service program within a communications infrastructure is begging for redefinition. And our regulatory agency, the FCC, was asked by Congress to come up with a plan to get into the 21st century. And so they came up with the National Broadband Plan that redefined universal service as broadband access. So this kind of lights a fire under the telecommunications infrastructure, because now there is a federal obligation for households to provide broadband access, to have broadband access by specific benchmark dates. So the whole policy has really changed, and with it a lot of other subsidiary regulations that I won't go into right now. But the redefinition of universal service to be broadband has totally shaken up a lot of the subsidy, so-called, they don't like the word subsidy, so-called, but I'll use it. The subsidy structures and the structures that governments use to try to prop up, say, small companies that are not particularly profitable but providing a good service. So we're in a stage right now that is very tenuous, actually, and that's filled with a lot of uncertainty with respect to how to ensure that these broadband services will roll out. So this National Broadband Plan then espouses the broadband standard, and interestingly enough, there's been some very interesting developments just in the last 2 years with other related services that are part of universal service, like adding rural health care into universal service, and to really look creatively at what wireless services could be and what they could do to fulfill the mandate of broadband service. And most interesting to me, I'm not sure if it's in this very next, most interesting to me is something that I'll talk about momentarily. Actually, let me turn back to this. It's actually an experiment with this particular category of service. Lifeline service is defined as services to people, it's a subsidy service basically, to poor households that can't afford, like it used to be couldn't afford a phone, now it would be couldn't afford internet access basically. So it's a subsidy program for lower socioeconomic status households. The new experiment is actually has resulted in a call that just came out a month ago for telecommunications providers to partner with researchers and to experiment with alternative ways of getting broadband adoption rates up in poor communities. So the idea is that maybe you, as a team of researchers, would collaborate with a phone company. You would target a neighborhood and say, I think we can get everybody on broadband if we do this and this and this. If we give everybody a computer, if we offer training courses, we do, so this is out right now. It's totally unprecedented to actually offer an experiment as part of building a national broadband adoption here. So it's empirical, it's pragmatic, and we've never had anything like it in the United States. I'd be curious to know if Korea has had anything like this in some other field. And then in the meantime, the newest iteration of the digital divide is beyond, we talked about access and we talked about adoption and beyond adoption. The latest notion has to do with what some people are calling meaningful adoption. And many researchers are now talking about meaningful internet use and broadband adoption in terms of explaining who, where, why, and how people are using the internet. So people are diving much more deeply into this whole constellation of attitudes, circumstances, and practices, and getting very granular and trying to understand what broadband adoption means to this community here, that community here. It's a highly contextualized approach, and so these are questions, for example, that the Census Bureau is asking about using the internet. Instead of simply saying, do you have access, they're really interested in these more nuanced aspects of how people are using the internet whether they rely on it for work, for entertainment, for financial transactions, and so forth. And this will feed into a lot of other interests as well, like having to do with health and civic engagement in particular. So the field experiment I talked about, this is just a line from the request for proposals here, is something that I'm totally fascinated with, frankly, and I'll be very interested to see what the outcome is. And I'm actually looking to partner with a telecom company to see if we can fool around with this idea. But this is, I think where I'll end. I've spoken longer than I intended to speak. But basically, my goal here was to kind of illustrate the way in which the convergence metaphor has in fact had a lot of holes in it, and there have been these sort of micro steps along the way to fill those holes. Gradually, we've moved toward a place where government policies have begun to grapple a little better, I think, with what broadband might mean and what that process of using it and getting it into people's lives in meaningful ways might be constituted by. So I'll finish it.
Okay, thank you very much. Now the floor is open for discussion. Just raise your hands.
Oh, it's the post-lunch sleep.
Yeah, I need to time think. Yeah.
I'm from the States. I've been teaching at KAIST for about 3 years, over. And of all things, I'm the director of Language Center now, so Jim Larson and I are colleagues.
Ah,
yeah. So one of the things that shocked me when I got here was that you have very high internet penetration rate, broadband is up there and so on, but the language skills are still very poor. Okay, so that about 80 to 90% of information on the internet is in English. Okay, and then I seriously doubt a high percentage of Koreans actually use anything other than information in Korean.
Okay.
Yeah. It's not true for KAIST students. They have to use English, but the majority of Koreans will probably use Korean websites and so on. So this idea of convergence, on the international scale, about the cross-cultural understanding on that, probably not happening.
Yeah.
Despite this high, broadband rate. So.
Mm-hmm. That's a really interesting observation. Yeah.
It is apparent that there is a positive relationship between internet penetration and broadband with the positive use of information. For example, the most beneficiary interest group in the internet is total movie producers and game makers, whether it is true or not. Anyway, but I wonder what is the implication of U.S. government to boost up the internet penetration without regarding such a positive relation or not?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's also a very interesting question, I think. It's it's part of the kind of very broad base of industries that are interested in increasing these statistics and increasing people's access to the internet. It kind of feeds right into the notion that, of course, the television system and the movie system want better ways and more varied ways to reach people with their various products. And these industries have lobbied periodically when some of these issues that I've reviewed come up, because they're most interested in any policy that will enhance the development of the network. They're especially interested in any development that will allow them as much free and unfettered access to the network. And there's I use the word bottleneck at one point in here, and there's a whole tier of companies that control what's called the last mile. And the last mile is your connection. You are the end of the connection. You are at the end of the last mile. And there's just a handful of companies that control that last mile. And to the extent that they have that control, they can easily say to content providers, if you want to get there, you're going to have to pay me a little bit more if you're going to get there fast. And this is the net neutrality ideas. So net neutrality has kind of been an arbiter of this, of some of these difficulties, and nobody knows exactly what's going to happen with net neutrality. But so far, I think these industries, they're behind the scenes. You know, Google actually is building infrastructure, has a lot of dark fiber throughout our country. Maybe they will be another important infrastructure provider at some point. Right now, they're not. So we don't really know. But those industries are there, but they're not prominent in the big public discourse on what this all means and what it amounts to. You know, commoditization, though, is certainly part of the American experience of the internet. How to sell things. How to sell things better. Yeah.
Thank you for your lecture. My question is about a little bit different level of convergence that you mentioned. The value and the impact of the IT on other industries are so significant. So there will be many emerging new industries converged both from IT and other industries. So in the case of convergence of IT and energy sector, I expect that IT will play a significant role, especially in the case of the smart grid.
Yes.
So, and also for the successful commercialization of electric vehicle, the automobile industry will have big interest in these energy issues. So energy industry will not be managed or operated by energy companies at all in the future, and IT will have some more power.
Or they might be converged.
Right, right. So I think in the United States, but the issue is that the United States is federal states. So there are 50 different states.
Mm-hmm.
That means 50
And territories.
yeah, and more than 50 different regulations and policies. So in terms of national establishment of national smart grid, or even for the current issue like national establishment of broadband, I guess there will be significant challenges for the U.S. And how do you think?
Well, not so much in broadband, because the states don't regulate broadband. They do not. The state role in regulating cable television is really pretty much gone entirely. And the state role in regulating what I'll call telecom companies, the kind of network building companies, is increasingly minor. It's there, but it's pretty minor. And whenever there is an interstate component, the federal government regulates that. So it's less of a matter in broadband. And I have to confess much more ignorance on the smart grid and the national energy grid. That was a focus in the National Broadband Plan, however. And the FCC clearly recognizes the importance of telecommunications to energy and to energy management and conservation. And actually some of those ARA projects that I mentioned were in energy as well. A different chunk of money was there, and they were very proactively experimenting with how you could build a national grid that was indeed smart. But you're right, energy regulation and authority is far more decentralized and regionalized, actually. So it could indeed become more of an issue. I thought where you were going with that question, I had one slide. I didn't get into Europe here, but I kind of liked this image because, well, no, I guess I'll do this one. Because the Europeans are really thinking of broadband as part of life. in so many ways, and they're really thinking of broadband as being embedded, and that's a word that I use a lot. To really understand broadband, you have to realize that it's embedded in a lot of other activities, like energy, like transportation, like manufacturing. And the Europeans have actually set some goals in terms of kind of apprehending how embedded broadband is in these various endeavors. And I kind of like the way they displayed a few of these data points, just because it in one fell swoop it shows you a lot of the sort of indicators that they're watching, and they're looking at small and medium enterprises using the internet to sell. They're looking at, well, regular use. Here's their disadvantaged group use, plain old internet use. E-government is something that they've got a metric for, because increasingly broadband access is becoming essential to even interact with government. It's becoming essential to interact with simple little employment sectors as well. I can really an anecdote. I work with one nonprofit that has mounted 70 public computing centers. And they found at one location they were getting a lot of new clients coming in to learn how to use the internet and computers specifically, because they wanted to work at Walmart. And Walmart, low tech, stocking, cashier. It turned out what they needed to do was they needed to know how to fill out a form online, because Walmart wasn't taking job applications in paper and pencil anymore. You had to fill it out online, and they didn't know how to do that. So these simple little transitions are becoming embedded in various industrial sites, basically, that require a kind of knowledge and expertise that many people are not prepared for. So that embeddedness, I think, is something that we're coming to grips with right now. That's about the best I can do in energy. Yeah, hi.
I'm an engineer from Silicon Valley, worked in startups and at Google before coming here, so I'm kind of interested in this. I have an observation and a series of different questions, so I'll break those up, so you don't have to hear them all at once.
Can you speak a little bit?
Yeah, of course. So one of the observations I had, Korea has an incredible penetration of broadband. It's very fast to access Korean websites. But a lot of websites are based in the US, and so websites like, say, YouTube or Facebook or Google even are oftentimes much, much slower in the US despite having a larger bandwidth, because the lag, or the actual latency of the connection is much slower.
I would think they'd have sites over here, near sites.
Google does have data centers, Facebook does not. They still have only the one in California. So just as an observation of, it's not just a matter of the actual size of the broadband, but also how close you are to the actual connection.
Yeah.
In terms of questions, I don't know if you can go back to the graph, the ITU information data.
Yeah. Oh, it's in Korean. There, no, I'll go down here.
You can pretend to read.
Yeah.
So I have an observation. I mean, right above the United States is Singapore.
Yeah.
Which I think could not be from the United States in terms of
Absolutely.
spatial. And
Absolutely.
I'm curious, I don't know if your researchers have really looked at other countries and their kind of rollout strategies.
I haven't. Yeah, I've looked a little bit, but I was searching high and low for one graph but couldn't find it. Many people have made this observation and said, and they've even made it about Korea, saying, it's a much smaller country, population, dense population center in Seoul. It's nothing like the formidable challenge faced in the United States. But if you plot a line here that presents a ratio of broadband penetration to square mile, to territory size, there's actually no relationship. The line goes all over the place. It's not a linear function of the size of the country at all. It has a lot more. It appears to have a lot more to do with the policy of the country on its space. And I wish I had that. But it exists, and I have seen it. Which is fascinating. one of the countries that a lot of people talk about in that respect is Sweden, which is, okay, not as big as the United States, but it also has a lot of rural, sparsely populated areas, and they have very high adoption and penetration and adoption there, as just one example.
Another component of this, we talk a lot about kind of the supply side of supplying the internet, but how much is the demand side taken into account? And we talked about, you should graph about what people want, third of them don't even want to use kind of this kind of technology. Next third, they say they cannot afford it. And presumably, if they cannot afford it, you know, is there an economic argument for why they want internet access? Are they able to, you know, in my case, I make a lot of money from using the internet because I program on the internet, but is there a kind of a demand side of it in which if these companies are not going out here to supply it, it's clearly not profitable for them.
To supply.
To supply, exactly. So if they're
under
not
the current regime. Yeah, I think it's this demand side that we really see the Obama administration kind of acknowledging, and that's the economic term for kind of meaning for beyond access, I think, and hence the interest in looking at all of these adoption factors. I think the bigger issue is a social one, and that is, to what extent is it in anybody's national, civic interest to have everybody equipped to be able to do what they have to do using the internet, whether it's to vote, to fill out a job application, to work at Walmart, to file for food stamps, now that, you know, once it's required that you apply for them online. You know, to what extent do we have kind of a social contract to make sure that there is something equitable? And that's really where, that's really the derivation. This is where universal service kind of begins. This whole notion of universal service grew up in the 1920s and 1930s. And it was kind of a social contract, because it said equal service for equal prices. The idea was everybody in the country should have access to a phone, and even though it costs a lot more to run that phone line out into the middle of nowhere, it's important for those farms to have telephone connections and not to have to pay through the nose for it. Profoundly uneconomic when it gets right down to it, but it was recognized that this was a social value. So, and arguably after the fact, one could say that you could kind of turn the economics on its head, and say the actual network becomes a lot more valuable as more people are on it. So that's what the Canadians do, actually, in a lot of their pricing strategies. They say if you join the network, you've made it a lot more valuable. So instead of the way Americans often frame it and say, if you live 5 miles outside of town, you're going to have to pay to get that line 5 miles out. So it's a little bit different. But the Obama, this ARA program in particular with public computing centers and what is called sustainable broadband adoption is an attempt to really grapple with the demand side. As is, I think, this new experiment to try different approaches to get low-income people to adopt in a research setting. You know, like they want control groups, and they really want to apply an empirical framing to what kind of solves this problem.
One final question. When we talk broadband, we talk about universal service with phones, which I think is a very easy concept to understand. It connects it, and it's a voice system. When we talk broadband on the internet, we're not just talking about wired connections, there's also wireless, Wi-Fi, 4G, LTE. There's all these different types of connections. So when we say we want universal service and broadband, I mean, is there a policy definition of exactly what that means? Is it a wire connection? Is it cell phone data plan?
This is part of the ongoing debate. It doesn't have to be. Under what the FCC is trying to recommend, it does not have to be landline. And this worries a lot of the mainline, the AT&Ts and the Verizons of the world. Even though they have substantial wireless networks, they've also invested a lot in trying to roll out landline networks, and they would like those landline networks used, actually. But no, part of the FCC's recognition in the broadband plan from 2010 is that there are regions of the country for which it would be much more economic to use wireless network, far more economic than wireline networks. So the interesting thing that they haven't really grappled with, well, they're in the process of, is what about smartphone access to the internet, and what about fast access? Does that constitute meaningful broadband? Is it enough that you can reach the internet on your cell phone? Does that mean the war is won and we don't really need to worry about the fact that you don't have enough money for a computer? So mobile phone penetration, of course, in the United States is very high, and folks in rural areas, just like folks in urban areas, want mobile phones. They want this. Given the economic circumstances, many of them will, of course, purchase their cell phone plans, but not a broadband subscription that would come into their home. They would just rely on their wireless access, and hence they've got their smartphone access. Now you could say, well, maybe they could tether. In the United States, that costs quite a bit of money. But this is kind of an issue that people are grappling with right now. Is that sufficient to say, okay, broadband adoption is there, what are you really going to do on your cell phone? And is it enough to constitute what we would call meaningful use, meaningful adoption? Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. Related to Danny's earlier question about the demand, so I've been thinking there must be some portion of people who, actively refuse to use the internet because of a lot of reasons.
Absolutely.
But then, well, if you have not used internet before, you don't know the value of it, and then you don't what kind of benefits you can get out of it, right?
Exactly.
So I'm not sure. I want to ask if any policies, sub policies that try to create the demand of internet for those who have not used internet before.
Well, it's kind of similar to the last question. How do you create demand? And just recently, with these two programs that I mentioned, the Sustainable Broadband Adoption Program and the Public Computing Center program, which includes a lot of training, there is an effort to at least provide some exposure to what's capable, what one could do on the internet. I did research on 4 rural communities with a team of people in three states: Michigan, which is way in the northern part of the country, Kentucky in the central part, and Texas, where I live. And we looked at rural communities that did not have broadband when we went and gathered our first data. Then they got broadband, and then we went back. So we had kind of a natural field experiment to see the difference. And one of our findings was that in the community where there were community leaders that said, popularized, to use the phrase that came up earlier in the luncheon, they popularized the internet. They gave public demonstrations. They talked about it. They had libraries offering sessions and things like that. That community really had the highest adoption rate. And we think, because the communities were pretty matched in terms of demographics, we think that that was a critical feature for enhancing the demand. It was the role of institutions in popularizing and demonstrating, in particular, the utility of the internet that seemed to make a huge role, a huge difference statistically. So, and this one program called Sustainable Broadband Adoption is doing something like that. It's basically demonstrating and training and trying to do whatever can be done to tackle exactly that. And that field experiment I mentioned is a demand-related issue as well.
Well, I think...
One more?
Yeah,
Okay.
Well, it
Yeah.
seems like a more general question, but it seems like we're in a stage of a rapid stage of transition from computers to mobile devices, and also the telecommunication technology is evolving so fast to the extent that the government can't get the data at the right time and maybe produce graphs like those.
Yes.
So do you see any efforts by the government to overcome the slow bureaucratic process over the technological innovation?
Well, I'd say baby steps. you know, since I did go to Washington to work on one of these programs, I saw the bureaucracy firsthand, and it was jaw-dropping. So, you know, it's hard to imagine anything getting done, frankly, but they do get some things done. I'm as I said, I'm kind of interested in the fact that, at least in this little field, there's some willingness to experiment. At least I count that as a major step forward. This kind of experimentation is done all the time in businesses, but it's almost never done with government. That's not really speaking to keeping up with technology. You know, I think the government, the American government, just relies on a steady stream of new talent, I think, and hopes that, and lobbyists, you know, because the companies in the industries involved in this are a presence indeed in Washington. I think there's a good dialogue there, but I think, for good or for ill, I think it's very difficult for the policy community to keep up with technological innovation. I think it's difficult for almost anybody to keep up with technological innovation. I think competitors don't know what to do. Sometimes the technology creators don't know what's going to happen with their technology. You know, they don't know if it's going to be seized or hacked or kind of reformed by the user base. I mean, there have been some very interesting examples of the way people use these technologies for their own purposes that are quite unanticipated by the inventors, which is what keeps it fun.
Can I ask a quick factual question?
Yeah.
So who really initiated ARA? Was it from the Obama administration? Was there a lobbying group or anything?
Well, there were groups that were behind it, but it was really Obama who wanted to, you know, it was part of this big stimulus bill, so there was investment in a lot of different industries. But ARA, once the telecom industries got wind of ARA, there was some behind-the-scenes stuff. In my little area, you know, I focused on rural. The rural phone companies were right in there, and they got language written into the way that money was dispersed that would favor them. And it's a good question, actually, because when I got there, I was astounded that they weren't going to be a little more innovative with how they were dispersing this money, but the language of the bill was for the rural program in particular was written to give a lot of favoritism to existing incumbent companies, and that was an automatic disadvantage to anybody trying to do something different. Yeah, sad to see.
My question is actually kind of related to that point,
Yeah.
because I really liked your emphasis on meaningful use of internet. Digital divide is not just about how to increase access or this very mechanical conception of filling the gap and things like that, but how to use, why people use and in what ways, and but as you know, the meaningful is value-added term, and the value is everybody has their own value, and
Yes.
it's so that there is a room for discussion here, but the whole drive for a program like ARA and others, if the powerful lobbying groups like the Google, Facebook, and other big money producers underwriting certain government policy, then their value is sort of I don't think it's bad, but anyway, filter through the business interest and then underwriting the government programs and then eventually benefiting them.
Yes.
And then so that it's interesting that the Republicans are switching to the Democrats, and the Democrats are more interested in the internet because basically the new industry of internet is underwriting their policies.
That's definitely part of it.
And so it's kind of interesting. It's just a democracy, working out how the value is being contested and embedded in the policy. But going back to Korea, I think Korea is crazy. I don't, in my opinion. And then we have too much broadband. I mean,
Yeah.
and without
Is there such a thing?
yeah, I don't know whether it's a really good or not. We don't really study the meanings of internet use, so I would say here it's not a digital divide, it's digital overuse. I mean, everybody is somehow at a different level addicted to some kind of access to the internet, and then it has a lot of social ramifications, and which haven't been studied fully. And then so sort of, my point is that Korea is sort of becoming a test ground in terms of social implications of convergence and then other issues, and the concept of meaningful use. I think it can be used here. I mean, what is the meaningful use in a place like Korea, in a place like United States, and in different countries, and then especially when we are thinking of big companies behind, and because some of the driver of the Korean internet broadband is also big companies.
Yes.
And so it's sort of it's not artificial, but it's made.
Yes.
Made by someone, and then and the values are added, and then the people are responding to that without knowing that some of the values are created by someone else.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good observation, and your question kind of traces a recursive cycle there of creating demand and supply. And supply feeds demand, and then demand creates supply, and it kind of goes back and forth. And you used a powerful word, the word addiction, of course, and many people do confess to being addicted. I'm never really sure what that means. But I don't really have a final answer for that. But in terms of what is meaningful use, it's for people like us to figure out, I think, what's meaningful use in a given context, and to try to channel that, if we want, into something that conforms to the values that are most useful, meaningful to be to a culture.
Right.
It's interesting. I'm working on another project that Warner Studios is funding. There's about 10 groups of researchers looking at how people are viewing television, defining television as just about anything that you do on your laptop or on your cell phone, anything entertaining. And one of the interesting reasons that they're funding this research is they don't know what is going on. They can't figure out how to keep up with how you find the next program that you're going to watch, what platform is best for you, whether you're going to go to so-called, our polite term in our survey work is unauthorized file sharing sites, or authorized file sharing sites, and they simply, and they're definitely trailing the curve. But I'm not sure anybody is out in front of the curve when it gets right down to it. So I think we're, at this point at least, we're in this kind of recursive cycle, and it's, if students can leave an institution like KAIST with a set of values in front of them that can be worked into both business policies and social policies. As a society, we're better off.
Yeah. Well, actually, speaking of addiction, I just a couple of days ago I read the student-run newspapers at KAIST, KAIST Times, and there are some articles about student performance linked with internet addiction, which is related to game addiction and other entertainment addiction, and the increased broadband connect basically made it happen. I mean, it's made it available to the students. And so its addiction is socially made, and it's
Of course,
Yeah.
a logical rejoinder to that would be, if not the internet, something else. Sex and gambling, big drivers in communication industries. It's true.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And we still have some time for discussion. I don't mean to end on my questions. Yes.
I have a question, but it's similar to the professor. Perhaps I don't think that is a question anymore. But I'm really concerned about the negative impacts to the society of the internet. So how do you think about the integration of, like, together with the effort to promote the internet diffusion? How about, is it equally important to have like certain educational programs that seriously warning the negative impact of the internet? I mean, it have to be come from the government effort.
I see a growing movement to cultivate so-called digital literacy, an awareness of the quality of information one gets on the internet, and even simply how to maneuver and navigate most usefully for one's own purposes. And there are a lot of educational settings that are embarking on a lot of these kinds of programs to deal with what I think you mean by the negative aspects of the
But it's like more from the social scientist side, but how about the government?
Well, in the United States, there will never be a federal law that has, beyond something having to do with sex, and pornography and indecent content, that sort of thing, that legislates away the negative effects of the internet, just as it's been tried for television. I mean, we have these moral panics associated with every new communication technology. They came with film, they came with radio, they came with television. There's always a moral panic. And we think that, oh my God, people are doing too much of this and they're neglecting that. It's very common. And the consensus usually a few years down the road is, A, we overreacted, and B, those negative consequences don't look so negative after all. So, I think we have to be very cautious in assigning, in making a particular technological system kind of a scapegoat for other problems in society. For example, I mean, this whole, I didn't say this explicitly in talking about the digital divide, but you have only to look at those demographic statistics to recognize that the digital divide is just a proxy for a social divide. If you're poor, less well educated, and a racial, ethnic minority, your statistics that your penetration and adoption is low. It's a social stratification issue. But and those early attempts at what I call drive-by technological remediation, throw a computer out the window and the problem is solved. That doesn't begin to address the profound sociological issues that kind of prompt the statistics to begin with.
Small question. Is there, like you mentioned about universal service, so is there any special services for students?
No. No. The E-rate is part of universal service. So in that sense, in providing connectivity and computers, there is that.
For schools, right?
Yes.
Because
yes.
my mom is a teacher in public school, and I heard that for Korean students who are below the line of poverty, that the Korean government has set, that the Korean government pay all the cell phone fees of the students, and my mom was kind of crazy about that because they're using too much of the cell phones, and because we have the smartphones and they use all that, and they are provided with a free laptop. So I was just wondering whether.
No, we don't have anything comparable. No, federal.
Do they have any policies regarding digital neutrality or the rights to
Not yet, but that actually, I think some companies are working on that. But I know of no formal legislation around that. It might exist, but I don't know it. And I have heard that some companies like Facebook are trying to devise something.
Because I heard that some news companies, you have to pay like up to $3,000 in order to erase your internet history.
I don't know it.
So do you know what kind of people are involved in regulating?
I don't know. No, I'm sorry. Interesting question.
Okay. Any other? If not, I'd like to thank you for your great lecture and then questions.